In a small, corrupt town, attorney Miles Bennett becomes the target of systemic racism and abuse of power after uncovering fraudulent land deeds. Framed and humiliated by a racist officer, Miles faces harassment, an unjust arrest, and the town's deep-rooted prejudice, led by figures who will stop at nothing to silence him. The story exposes the infuriating realities of racism in America and how corrupt systems exploit their power. Pushing one man to fight back against injustice despite overwhelming odds. Will truth prevail, or will corruption win? This is a battle that will leave you outraged and hooked. The crisp morning air carried a certain stillness, broken only by the hum of early commuters making their way into downtown Brookfield. Among them was Thomas Hartwell, a man whose life had been defined by routine. A veteran factory foreman, Thomas liked things simple, predictable. But on this particular morning, something was about to shatter that simplicity in ways he couldn't imagine. The sunlight filtered through the windshield as Thomas drove his rusted pickup truck down Highway 41, his radio crackling with the tinny voice of an old country singer. He had one stop to make before heading to work, the old gas station just off the highway. Thomas turned into the station, the tires crunching over gravel. As he climbed out, his weathered hands reached for the pump, his mind already drifting to the day's workload. That's when he noticed something strange. A sleek black sedan parked near the edge of the lot, its windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors. Thomas frowned. Brookfield was the kind of town where you knew everyone's car, and that was no local vehicle. Something about it gnawed at him. The pump clicked, and Thomas replaced the nozzle, giving the sedan one last glance before heading inside to pay. The gas station cashier, Molly, greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You see that car out there?" Thomas asked, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. Molly's smile faltered. "Yeah," she said, keeping her voice low. "It's been sitting there since yesterday. No one's gotten out." Thomas's brow furrowed. "Strange." Molly shrugged, but there was a flicker of unease in her expression. As Thomas stepped back outside, he gave the car another lingering look. For a brief moment, he swore he saw movement, just the slightest ripple of a figure shifting in the driver's seat. The hair on his neck prickled, but he shook it off. He climbed back into his truck, slamming the door shut. It's probably nothing, he thought. But as he pulled onto the road, a glance in the rearview mirror made his stomach drop. The black sedan had pulled out of the gas station and was following him. The quiet hum of the early morning blanketed the streets of Ashford, a small town clinging stubbornly to traditions that refused to fade. Sunlight seeped through the edges of the horizon, casting long shadows over rows of mom-and-pop shops, churches with weathered steeples, and front porches adorned with rocking chairs. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. At the edge of town, nestled behind a row of old oak trees, sat the Ashford Diner. The smell of fried eggs and fresh coffee lingered in the crisp air, escaping through the cracked window of the kitchen. The diner was an institution. Cheap meals, stiff coffee, and gossip served by the plateful for decades. It had been the unofficial heart of the community. Inside, among the creak of vinyl booths and the scrape of forks on ceramic plates, sat Miles Bennett. From the outside, Miles could have been anyone. His black sweatshirt loose against his tall, muscular frame, faded jeans cuffed neatly above polished boots, a pair of round glasses perched low on his nose, and a ball cap hid the faint streaks of silver running through his otherwise jet-black hair. He sat alone at a corner booth with a newspaper spread out before him, a steaming cup of coffee resting untouched at his side. To the regulars, like the two farmers whispering in the next booth, or the grey-haired waitress wiping down the counter, Miles was just another traveller stopping through someone unremarkable. And that suited him just fine, because Miles Bennett, despite the quiet way he carried himself, was far from ordinary. At 43, he was one of the most respected corporate attorneys in the state, A man who built his career dismantling corrupt systems brick by brick. His name carried weight in courtrooms and boardrooms alike, but you wouldn't know that by looking at him. This morning, Miles had driven 2 hours out of the city, escaping the polished steel skyscrapers and conference rooms that usually shaped his days. He had a meeting nearby at noon, a small-town land dispute that had drawn his attention. But more than that, he'd come for something simple: peace. He didn't need much: a quiet place, a cup of coffee, a moment where the weight of who he was and what he represented could lift, even if only for a little while. Miles folded the newspaper, smoothing out its creases as he turned his attention to the diner's only waitress on duty, a thin woman in her mid-50s with tired eyes. Her name tag read, Linda. "Excuse me, ma'am," Miles called out gently, lifting his coffee cup with a small smile. "Could I bother you for a refill?" Linda turned, pausing mid-wipe. Her eyes lingered on him longer than necessary, a brief flicker of something in her gaze, though Miles couldn't quite place it. Suspicion, surprise. Either way, it wasn't friendly. Without a word, she grabbed the coffee pot and ambled over to his table. "You not from around here," she stated flatly, not bothering to make it a question. She poured the coffee halfway before stopping. Miles kept his smile polite. "Just passing through." Linda pursed her lips, her expression guarded. She finished pouring and shuffled back toward the counter, without another word. Miles let the moment pass, his attention drifting out the window. Across the street, an American flag fluttered lazily in the wind. He didn't mind the cold reception. After years of navigating spaces where he was either underestimated or mistrusted, it was hardly unfamiliar. The bell above the diner door jingled suddenly, jolting him from his thoughts. 3 men walked in, their voices loud enough to cut through the morning stillness. They wore denim jackets and ball caps pulled low. Local contractors, Miles guessed, judging by the mud-streaked boots. One of them, stocky with a weathered face, caught sight of Miles as they passed his table. "You lost, bud," the man said, a sharpness to his tone that didn't match the smile curling his lips. Miles glanced up slowly. He held the man's gaze for half a second longer than necessary before shaking his head. "No, just waiting on breakfast." "Uh-huh," the man replied, lingering a moment too long. His 2 friends snickered quietly, nudging each other as they slid into a booth. Linda appeared with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, setting it down with a clatter. "There you go," she muttered. "Thank you," Miles replied. His voice, even he picked up his fork and took a bite, savoring the simplicity of the meal. It was then that he heard them, the men's voices carrying from the next booth. The words were hushed, but not enough to hide their intent. "City folks always think they can just stroll in here. Saw a car like that parked outside. Looks new, betcha he's some big-shot lawyer or politician. Yeah, well, don't mean nothing here." Miles paused mid-bite, his appetite suddenly gone. He didn't look up, didn't react, though he could feel their eyes on him now. Curious. Testing. Over the years, he had learned to pick his battles. There were men like this in every small town, every boardroom. Men who felt threatened by people like him, by his success, by his calm confidence. So he took another bite of toast and let the conversation die on its own. But then the door jingled again, this time accompanied by the sharp click of heels against linoleum. Miles glanced up and froze. A woman entered the diner, her presence commanding the room the moment she stepped inside. She was striking, tall, poised, and immaculately dressed in a cream-colored suit that contrasted starkly with the worn interior of the diner. Her dark hair was pulled into a sleek bun, and her eyes, sharp, perceptive, scanned the room with practiced precision. She spotted Miles almost immediately and approached. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice crisp. "I've been looking for you." Miles sighed softly, setting down his fork. "Dahlia," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of familiarity. Dahlia Morgan was his assistant, a brilliant woman who kept his professional life stitched together with clockwork precision. She was also a stickler for punctuality, which explained the faint exasperation on her face. "You're supposed to be in court this afternoon," she said pointedly, pulling out her phone to check the time. "I assumed you'd be reviewing your notes." "I am," Miles replied, gesturing to the newspaper beside him. Dahlia raised an eyebrow. "Charming. Well, when you're done blending in with the locals, we need to talk." A low murmur rose from the next booth, followed by a snicker. Miles glanced over to find the same stocky man watching them intently, his lip curled. "Don't see many suits like that around here," the man muttered, just loud enough to carry. "Guess we know who's paying your bills, huh?" Dahlia froze mid-step, her gaze snapping toward the man like a whip. "Excuse me." The man shrugged, his expression a mix of smugness and challenge. Miles set his coffee down, his jaw tight. "Dahlia," he said softly. "Let it go." Her eyes flashed, but she nodded stiffly and turned back to him. "I'll wait outside," she muttered, before striding toward the door. The stocky man leaned back, his smile growing wider. "Guess she told you," he snorted, looking to his friends for approval. Miles exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. He could feel the weight of the room shifting. Curiosity from the regulars, amusement from the three men he'd been here before. Slowly, he turned to face the man fully, his expression calm but unflinching. "I'd be careful with your assumptions," Miles said evenly. The man's grin faltered slightly. "Oh yeah, why's that?" Miles didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black leather case. He flipped it open, revealing a gold badge and a neatly embossed card. "Miles Bennett," he said quietly. "Special counsel for the state of Illinois." The man's face paled. The diner fell into a sudden hush, the silence so thick it seemed to hum. Miles held the man's gaze for a moment longer before tucking the badge away. "Enjoy your breakfast." He slid a crisp bill onto the table, rose from his seat, and walked out without another word. The door jingled as he stepped outside, where Dahlia was waiting beside his sleek black sedan, arms crossed. "Everything okay in there?" she asked. Miles nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "Let's go," he said quietly. As they pulled onto the road, the diner faded into the rearview mirror, but the tension lingered like a shadow. Miles Bennett didn't speak for a long moment as the black sedan hummed smoothly down the cracked two-lane road, leaving the diner and its tension behind. The hum of the engine filled the silence between him and Dahlia, but she knew better than to push for conversation just yet. Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp and assessing. "You good?" she finally asked, her tone light but probing. Miles didn't look at her. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed on the road, his hands relaxed on the wheel, as if steering came as naturally as breathing. But his jaw was tight, a small tell Dahlia had learned to read over the years. "Fine," he said quietly. Dahlia scoffed. "You're a terrible liar." That made him glance at her, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. It was a fleeting moment, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Stuff like that's expected, Dahlia," he murmured, his tone soft but weighted. "Men like that small-town big talk, it's nothing new." "That doesn't mean it's right," she shot back, folding her arms. "I swear, it's like they see you in a sweatshirt and suddenly I'm not me anymore," Miles finished, his voice calm but edged with something Dahlia couldn't quite pin down. "I know I've been dealing with it my entire life." Her frown deepened. "It's exhausting, though, watching people look at you like you're nothing, like you haven't earned everything you've worked for." Miles didn't respond. He didn't need to. The rest of the drive was quiet, save for the low hum of the tires against the road. As they approached the Ashford courthouse, a squat, brick building that looked more like a high school than a seat of justice. Dahlia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and sighed. "Judge Carver's clerk just sent me a reminder," she said. "The hearing's at 1 o'clock sharp. Carver's known for being punctual." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Judge Carver, huh? Name sounds familiar." "It should. He's been here for decades," Dahlia replied. "And let's just say his reputation isn't exactly progressive." Miles didn't need to ask for clarification. He'd dealt with judges like Carver before, men who clung to power with tight fists, their rulings often tainted by outdated perspectives. He suspected this was a judge who wouldn't see him as a brilliant attorney, a decorated legal mind, or even as an equal. He'd see him as something else entirely. And that thought tightened something in Miles's chest. Still, he smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's just another day, Dahlia." She shook her head, murmuring under her breath, "You shouldn't have to say that." The courthouse was quiet when they entered, the faint echo of their footsteps bouncing off the walls of the main hallway. The decor was a time capsule of the 1960s. Wood paneling, faded portraits of stern-looking men in black robes, and a grandfather clock that ticked a little too loudly. Miles adjusted the cuffs of his jacket as he stepped toward the clerk's window, where a pale, freckled woman with round glasses sat behind thick glass. She looked up as Miles approached and smiled politely, until her gaze landed on him. Her expression faltered, almost imperceptibly, but Miles caught it. He always caught it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yes." "Miles Bennett, counsel for the plaintiffs in the Wright v. Thompson case," Miles said smoothly, handing over his paperwork. She stared at the papers as though she were reading a foreign language. Dahlia, standing just behind Miles, shifted her weight and shot him a look that said, "Here we go again." "I'm sorry," the clerk said after a beat, her eyes flicking between Miles and the papers. "You're the attorney for the plaintiffs?" Miles's smile remained steady, though it cooled slightly. "That's correct." "Are you sure you're not here for something else?" Dahlia let out an audible breath through her nose, but Miles held up a hand to steady her. He leaned closer to the glass, his voice dropping a fraction. "I've already provided my credentials, ma'am. If there's an issue, I suggest you take it up with the judge," he said evenly. The clerk blinked, seemingly thrown by his calm, firm tone. "I'll, let the judge know you're here." She disappeared through a door, leaving Miles and Dahlia in the empty hall. Dahlia turned to him, her voice low but biting. "Are you sure you're not here for something else?" she mimicked. "The hell is that supposed to mean?" Miles exhaled through his nose, keeping his voice calm. "Let it go, Dahlia." She crossed her arms, shaking her head. "I hate this. I hate how they look at you. How they assume you're someone else just because you don't fit their little picture of what success is supposed to look like." "It's not worth the fight right now," he replied softly. Dahlia narrowed her eyes at him. "If you keep saying that, Miles, one day you're going to explode." When the clerk returned, her demeanor was stiffer, as though she'd been instructed to maintain a polite distance. "Judge Carver will see you now," she said curtly. Miles led the way into the courtroom. It was small, with wooden pews on either side, and an old wooden bench at the front where Judge Carver sat. Judge Harold Carver looked every bit the part of a man who'd ruled over a town like Ashford for decades. Late 60s, broad-shouldered, his jowled face framed by thinning white hair. His expression as Miles entered the room was inscrutable, his pale blue eyes sharp, his mouth a thin, disapproving line. "Mr. Bennett," Carver said, his tone just short of condescending. "Glad to see you've made it all the way out here." Miles offered a polite nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Wright versus Thompson," Carver continued, flipping through his notes. "Land dispute case straightforward enough, wouldn't you say?" "Yes, Your Honor," Miles replied. "The facts are clear, and I'm confident the evidence will— Facts are one thing, Carver interrupted, raising a hand, but cases like these often come down to perspective. Miles blinked, keeping his expression neutral. I'm not sure I follow, Your Honor. Carver set down the papers and peered over his glasses. What I mean, Mr. Bennett, is that city lawyers like yourself have a tendency to come into towns like this and misunderstand the way things work. A long silence settled over the room, thick as fog. Dahlia stiffened visibly behind Miles, her nails digging into her notebook. Miles, however, didn't so much as flinch. He clasped his hands in front of him and held Carver's gaze with the same quiet strength he'd used his entire life. With all due respect, Your Honor, he said calmly, justice doesn't change based on geography. Carver's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, more of a challenge. We'll see about that, Mr. Bennett. The hearing itself was short but grueling. Carver interrupted Miles repeatedly, dismissing critical arguments with thinly veiled disdain. When opposing counsel, a local lawyer who looked far more comfortable in Carver's courtroom made his case, the judge listened with an attentiveness he hadn't afforded Miles. By the time it ended, Miles felt like he'd been chipping away at stone with his bare hands. Carver adjourned, promising to rule in a few days, though the look in his eyes said it all. Outside the courthouse, Dahlia let out a sharp breath. Unbelievable. He practically dismissed you before you even opened your mouth. Miles loosened his tie, his face unreadable. I know. And the worst part? It's not about your arguments or your evidence. It's you. You could have the strongest case in the world, and Carver still wouldn't see you as anything other than an outsider. Miles stopped walking and turned to her. For the first time that day, something flickered in his expression. Tiredness, frustration, anger. You're right, but it's my job to keep going anyway. Dahlia stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. You'll win, she said quietly. You always do. Miles smiled faintly, though there was no triumph in it. Not every fight's about winning, Dahlia. And as he looked back at the courthouse, a building that stood as a symbol of a system resistant to change, Miles felt the weight of the fight he carried. It was heavy, unrelenting, but it was his. And he wouldn't put it down. The afternoon sun blazed over Ashford, casting sharp shadows across the small courthouse parking lot. Miles Bennett stood by his sedan, his jacket folded neatly over his arm, the air around him thick with unspoken words. Dahlia was leaning against the passenger door, staring at her phone and shaking her head. Carver's ruling is going to be a joke, she muttered, her voice tight with frustration. He couldn't have made it clearer if he'd shouted it from the bench. Miles didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the courthouse steps where Judge Carver's clerk, her stiff demeanor unmistakable even from a distance, was speaking with two uniformed officers. One of the officers, broad-shouldered and imposing, tilted his head toward them. A flicker of unease flared in Miles's gut. Dahlia, he said softly, straightening up. Put your phone away. What, why? Just do it, he said, his voice firm. Before she could respond, the officers began their descent toward him, their boots pounding against the concrete like an ominous drumbeat. Officer Daniels Miles recognized him immediately, broad-shouldered, white, with a face that looked carved from stone. He was a well-known figure in Ashford, with a reputation that preceded him. He wasn't just law enforcement here. He was the law, or at least the version of it, that operated unchecked in small corners of the world like this. The second officer, Mitchell, shorter, younger, and clearly less sure of himself, trailed slightly behind, his face unreadable. Miles Bennett, Daniels called out, his voice carrying over the lot, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Miles turned, meeting the officer's gaze with calm steadiness. Yes, that's me. Daniels stopped a few feet away, his hand resting pointedly on his belt. Not on his gun, but close enough to make the message clear. Dahlia, now standing rigid beside the car, shot Miles a look that screamed, "What now?" "You're under arrest," Daniels said, his tone flat. The words hit the air like a gunshot. Dahlia froze. Miles blinked once, his face perfectly still. For what, exactly? Daniels pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it up. Failure to comply with a court order, trespassing, and unauthorized interference with local property claims. Miles narrowed his eyes, the calm in his expression hardening into something sharper. "That's absurd. I've done nothing of the sort." "You can argue that in court," Daniels replied coldly. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." Dahlia took a step forward, her voice trembling with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't—" "Ma'am, I suggest you back up." Daniels cut her off, his eyes flicking toward her. "This doesn't concern you." "It does concern me," she snapped. "And this is harassment you don't even—" "Dahlia," Miles said quietly, holding up a hand to stop her. "It's fine." "It's not fine," she shot back, her voice cracking. "They're trying to humiliate you." Miles turned to Daniels, who was watching him with open disdain. He held out his hands calmly, deliberately. "Do what you need to do." Daniels smirked faintly, as if he'd won something. Mitchell, still silent, looked away, his jaw tight. The cuffs were cold and unnecessarily tight, as Daniels snapped them around Miles's wrists. It wasn't the first time he'd been in cuffs, but the indignity of it never grew easier. He kept his head held high as Daniels guided him toward the patrol car, aware of the looks from people passing by. A woman walking her dog. A teenager leaning out of a pickup window to gawk. "This is ridiculous!" Dahlia muttered furiously behind them, her heels clacking against the pavement. "I'll call the state bar. I'll call the press. You'll regret this." Daniels ignored her. He opened the back door of the patrol car and motioned for Miles to get in. "Careful now, counselor," he sneered. "Wouldn't want to scuff up your fancy shoes." The ride to the station was silent. Miles stared out the window, his mind spinning. Daniels wanted him humiliated. That much was clear. This wasn't about breaking any laws. This was about power, about putting him in his place. How far would they take this? He shifted slightly in the seat, the cuffs biting into his wrists. Stay calm, he reminded himself. Stay measured. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. The patrol car finally pulled into the lot of the Ashford police station. Another squat, aging building with peeling paint and flickering lights. Daniels pulled him roughly from the back seat, his grip too tight on Miles's arm. "Watch your step," he muttered, though his tone made it clear he didn't care if Miles fell flat on his face. Inside, the station was dim and stale. Officers milled around behind desks, a few glancing up as Miles was led through the room. He didn't miss the way their eyes lingered, curious, some amused. Daniels steered him toward the booking desk, where an older officer sat flipping through a clipboard. The man looked up and raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Bennett claims he's some big-shot lawyer," Daniels replied, emphasizing the words with mocking disdain. "Trespassing and failure to comply." The older officer frowned slightly, his eyes narrowing on Miles. "Trespassing." "Court order," Daniels said, though he offered no paperwork to back up his claim. Miles finally spoke, his voice steady. "I'd like to make a phone call. I have a right to representation." Daniels smirked. "Oh, don't worry, counselor. We know you're a lawyer." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "But out here, you're just another man in handcuffs." Miles didn't flinch, though his pulse thudded heavily in his ears. He'd seen this kind of arrogance before, but never had it felt so brazen. "Put him in holding," Daniels said, motioning to Mitchell, who had been standing silently in the corner. For a moment, Mitchell hesitated. His gaze flickered to Miles, then to Daniels, then back again. There was uncertainty there, an inner struggle playing out in the young officer's eyes. Daniels, I don't think... I said put him in holding, Daniels snapped, cutting him off. Or do you need me to do it myself? Mitchell swallowed hard, his expression tight. Finally, he stepped forward, reaching for Miles's arm with far more care than Daniels had shown. Come on, sir, he said quietly. Miles let himself be led down the dim hallway toward the holding cells, the sound of Daniels' laughter ringing in his ears. The holding cell was small, its walls covered in scratches and peeling paint. Mitchell unlocked the cuffs and stepped back, looking deeply uncomfortable as Miles rubbed his sore wrists. You'll get your call soon, Mitchell said after a moment, his voice low. Miles studied him. The young officer wouldn't meet his eyes, but there was a crack in his composure, a sliver of doubt that hadn't been there before. You know this is wrong, Miles said softly. Mitchell's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Miles took a step closer. Whatever Daniels is trying to do, it won't work. People like him they push because they think they can get away with it, but all it takes is one person to stand up. Mitchell finally looked up, his expression conflicted. I don't make the rules. No, Miles replied, but you decide how far you'll let them go. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick. Then Mitchell turned and walked out of the cell, locking the door behind him. Miles sat on the edge of the narrow cot, exhaling slowly as the door clanged shut. The sound echoed in the small room, loud and final, but Miles' mind was already turning, calculating. He knew this wouldn't end here. Daniels and men like him thrived on intimidation, on breaking people down bit by bit. But Miles Bennett wasn't so easily broken. The air in the holding cell was thick and stale. Miles Bennett sat on the narrow steel cot, hands folded, his face unreadable. He focused on his breathing, steady, deliberate, forcing down the simmering anger that threatened to rise. He'd been here before, not here specifically, but in situations like this, where the veneer of justice slipped, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. He had spent his life fighting these battles, dismantling broken systems one courtroom at a time. Yet sitting here now, cuffed and caged, a quiet frustration gnawed at him. Despite all his achievements, all his accolades, there were still places, men, who would only ever see him as one thing. A soft clink echoed as the lock on the holding cell door turned. Miles looked up to see Officer Mitchell stepping inside. The young officer's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously to the hallway before settling on Miles. Sir, Mitchell began quietly, I shouldn't be in here, but you need to hear this. Miles raised an eyebrow, remaining silent. Mitchell hesitated, as if weighing an invisible scale in his mind, before he spoke again. Daniels has no grounds for your arrest. I've seen the paperwork. It's bogus. Miles tilted his head, curiosity breaking through his composed mask. Bogus? It's not real. The court order he mentioned. It's unsigned and doesn't exist in any state record, Mitchell said, his voice low, as if he feared the walls themselves might listen. He made it up. Miles's pulse quickened, though his expression remained impassive. Why? Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his short hair. I don't know exactly, but Daniels has pull here. Word is he's got connections with Thompson, the guy you're up against in that land dispute case. Miles exhaled slowly, the pieces clicking into place. Of course Thompson, an old land baron with deep roots in Ashford, a man who stood to lose a great deal if Miles succeeded in court. The arrest wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about sending a message, humiliation control. Mitchell took a step closer, his voice urgent. Daniels is playing dirty. Mr. Bennett and Carver's in on it. They think you'll cut a deal or leave town if they lean on you hard enough. The admission hung in the air, heavy and bitter. Miles looked up at the young officer, searching his face. He saw conflict there, a man who knew right from wrong, but feared the consequences of speaking up. Miles's voice was calm, but firm. "Why are you telling me this, Officer Mitchell?" Mitchell hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because it's not right," he muttered. "I didn't sign up for this job to be part of something dirty. I can't look the other way." "You don't have to," Miles replied, his tone measured. "You've already taken the first step." Mitchell swallowed hard, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Look, I can get you out. I'll log the arrest as incomplete and say the paperwork was misplaced, but it'll only buy you time. Daniels is persistent." Miles nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Time is all I need." Mitchell looked over his shoulder nervously before pulling a keyring from his belt. The metallic rattle echoed through the room as he unlocked the cuffs binding Miles's wrists. "I'll take you out the back," Mitchell said quickly. "But you need to move fast. Daniels will come looking for you." The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky as Mitchell led Miles through a dim hallway toward the station's rear exit. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the stakes rising with every creak of the floor beneath them. Miles' mind was already moving, working through his next steps. As they reached the exit, Mitchell stopped short and turned to face him. "Whatever you're planning to do," he said quietly, "be careful men like Daniels don't go down easy." Miles met his gaze, a calm fire burning in his eyes. "They never do." Mitchell nodded, though he looked unconvinced. He cracked the door open and motioned for Miles to go. "Hurry and good luck." "Thank you, Officer Mitchell," Miles replied, the weight of sincerity in his words. "You did the right thing." With that, Miles stepped out into the fading light. Dahlia was already waiting for him, pacing furiously beside the sedan she'd parked a block away. When she spotted him emerging from the alley, her face flashed with a mix of relief and fury. "Miles!" she hissed, jogging toward him. "What the hell is going on? I've been trying to get through to the state bar, to the governor's office, someone who can pull strings, but nobody's picking up." Miles held up a hand, his calm demeanor steadying her like a rock against a rising tide. "It's Daniels. The arrest was fake, fabricated to scare us off." Dahlia's jaw dropped, her voice rising. "Fake? They arrested you based on nothing?" "Yes, and it tells me one thing," Miles said quietly. "We're getting too close. Thompson, Daniels, Carver. They're protecting something." Dahlia stared at him, her eyes blazing with disbelief. "So what now? You can't just let this slide. Daniels needs to be exposed." "We will," Miles replied, his voice calm but firm. "But first, we need proof." "What kind of proof?" Miles turned to her, his eyes sharp. "The land records, the ones Thompson claims give him ownership. There's something they don't want us to see. I'd bet my license on it." Dahlia narrowed her eyes, realization dawning on her face. "You think they falsified them? Or worse?" Dahlia exhaled sharply. "And where do we find the records?" Miles looked back at the courthouse, its darkened windows staring down at them like unblinking eyes. "Carver's office tonight." Her eyes widened. "You're not serious? You're going to break into the courthouse?" Miles shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Of course not, you are." "What?" "I'm kidding," he added, the smile turning genuine. "But we are going in legally. There's a way." Dahlia shot him a look that was equal parts exasperation and awe. "Fine, but if we're caught, I'm blaming you. Deal." Night fell quickly over Ashford, the quiet streets bathed in moonlight and flickering street lamps. Miles and Dahlia approached the courthouse with deliberate caution, their steps muffled by the cool evening air. "Are you sure about this?" Dahlia whispered, clutching her tablet tightly to her chest. "If Carver finds us here..." "He won't." Miles said confidently. "We're not breaking any laws." He pulled out a document and handed it to her. Freedom of Information Act. "We're requesting public records, nothing more." Dahlia stared at him. "You really are insufferable when you're right, you know that." "I've heard." Miles led the way up the courthouse steps, pushing open the double doors. The interior was dim, the only sound the faint hum of an old ventilation system. The clerk's office was to the left, its door locked, but not for long. Miles pulled a set of slim tools from his pocket, earning a sharp glare from Dahlia. "You carry lockpicks?" "I'm a lawyer. I'm prepared for everything." In seconds, the lock clicked open. Miles stepped inside, Dahlia following close behind. The room was small and cramped, filing cabinets lining the walls like sentinels. "Start with the property archives," Miles whispered, heading toward the nearest cabinet. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they combed through files. Dahlia flipped through folders rapidly, her movements frantic but precise. "Wait," she breathed suddenly, freezing mid-motion. "Miles, look at this." She held up a sheet of paper, a land deed stamped with Thompson's signature, but something was off. The ink was too fresh, the date inconsistent with the file it was stored in. "It's forged," Miles said softly, a grim satisfaction in his tone. "And if we can prove this," Dahlia whispered, her voice shaking, "we have them." Before Miles could respond, a noise echoed from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. Dahlia's eyes widened. "Someone's here." Miles's jaw tightened. "It's Daniels." The sound of footsteps echoed down the courthouse hallway, deliberate and heavy. Each creak of the floorboards felt like a warning shot. Dahlia froze, the incriminating deed clutched tightly in her hands, her eyes wide with panic. "It's him," she whispered, barely audible. Miles didn't need to ask who he already knew. "Get behind me," he said calmly, his voice low but commanding. "Miles, we need to go." "Too late for that," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the glass door as a shadow grew closer. The door swung open hard, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Officer Daniels stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway, his silhouette cast against the dim light of the hallway. His hand hovered just above the baton on his belt. Though his smirk made it clear, he was already feeling victorious. "Well, well," Daniels drawled, his voice heavy with mockery. "Look what we've got here. I should have known you couldn't stay quiet." Miles stood tall, his posture unflinching as he locked eyes with the officer. "What do you want, Daniels?" Daniels took a slow step forward, his boots thudding against the linoleum floor. "What do I want?" he echoed, feigning surprise. "Funny, because I was about to ask you the same thing, you see. Breaking into a courthouse after hours, that's a serious offense, even for a fancy lawyer like yourself." "We're not breaking in," Miles replied steadily. "We're accessing public records under the Freedom of Information Act. You should know that." Daniel's smirk faltered for half a second, a flicker of irritation passing over his face, but he recovered quickly. "That so looks to me like you're up to no good, snooping through things that don't concern you." "Oh, they concern me," Miles shot back, his voice cold as steel. "You and Thompson fabricated a land deed. You've been protecting him, using your badge to intimidate and silence anyone who gets in his way, including me." The accusation hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Dahlia edged closer, the forged deed gripped so tightly in her hands that the paper crinkled. Daniel's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "That's a bold accusation, Bennett. You got proof?" Miles nodded toward Dahlia. "More than enough. And when I bring this to court, and to the state bar, you won't have a badge to hide behind anymore." Daniel's jaw tightened, the smugness draining from his face. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the courthouse ventilation system. Then, With a sudden burst of movement, Daniels lunged forward. "Hand it over," he barked, reaching for Dahlia. She gasped, stumbling back, but Miles moved first. In a flash, he stepped between them, blocking Daniels' path. The officer froze, his face inches from Miles, his expression contorted with anger. "Don't," Miles said quietly, his voice deadly calm. Daniels sneered. "What are you going to do, lawyer, quote me the Constitution?" "No," Miles replied, his tone like ice. "I'll hold you accountable." Daniels' nostrils flared, his patience wearing thin. He grabbed the baton from his belt and raised it slightly, just enough to make his threat clear. "Move, or I'll make you." For the first time, Dahlia's panic turned to fear. "Miles, don't!" But Miles didn't move. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and his voice dropped to a tone so quiet, so steady, it shook the air itself. "You think you're untouchable, Daniels?" Miles asked, his eyes boring into the officer's. "That you can bully and intimidate your way out of this? That I won't fight back? You've underestimated me since the moment you saw me, because you couldn't see past your own bias. You thought a man like me would back down, that I'd cower and slink away quietly." Daniel said nothing, but his grip on the baton tightened. "But you don't know me," Miles continued, his voice rising ever so slightly. "I've spent my entire life fighting men like you bullies who think their power makes them invincible. You might hold the baton, Daniels. You might even hold the keys to the jail. But here's the thing, men like you always fall. You talk a big game," Daniels growled, "but in the end, words don't mean a damn thing." "Then let's see what actions do," Miles shot back. Before Daniels could respond, a voice broke through the tension. "Daniels!" All heads turned to the doorway. Officer Mitchell stood there, his face pale but resolute, a hand hovering near the radio on his chest. He looked like a man who had just crossed an invisible line and knew he could never go back. "What the hell are you doing?" Mitchell demanded, stepping into the room. Daniels turned on him sharply. "Get out, Mitchell. This doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't," Mitchell snapped. "I know what's going on. The fake arrest, the forged deeds. All of it. You're covering for Thompson, and you're using the badge to do it." Daniels froze, his face hardening. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," Mitchell shot back. His hand dropped to his radio. "And I'm done staying quiet." The room stilled. Daniels' eyes flickered between Miles, Dahlia, and Mitchell, his composure cracking like glass. For a split second, Miles could see it. The realization that he'd been cornered. Daniels took a step back, his gaze shifting to Miles with open hatred. "You think you've won?" he spat. Miles met his gaze, his voice steady. "No, I think it's over." Daniels didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the room, his heavy boots pounding the floor like distant thunder. Mitchell watched him go, his hand still hovering near his radio, his face a mask of determination. For a moment, the room was silent again, save for the sound of Dahlia's shaky breaths. "That's it?" she whispered, clutching the deed to her chest. "He just left?" Miles shook his head. "No," he replied quietly. "This isn't over, but now we have what we need." He turned to Mitchell, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Officer Mitchell. You made the right choice." Mitchell nodded stiffly, though his face was pale. "You'll need to move fast," he said. "Daniels won't give up. He'll try to spin this, cover his tracks." Miles smiled faintly. "Then we'll be faster." Outside the courthouse, the night air was sharp and cool. Miles and Dahlia moved quickly to the car, the forged deed carefully tucked into a file Dahlia held close. As Miles slid behind the wheel, Dahlia looked over at him, her face still flushed with adrenaline. "We have them, Miles. We have proof Daniels, Carver, Thompson. They can't get away with this. Miles nodded, his expression resolute. They won't. But Daniels won't go quietly, Dahlia warned, her voice dropping. He's dangerous. Miles turned to her, his eyes calm but burning with purpose. Let him come, he said softly, because this time, I'm ready for him. He started the car, the engine rumbling to life as the courthouse faded into the rearview mirror. The road ahead was dark, uncertain. But Miles had spent his life navigating roads like this. And this fight? This fight was far from over. The distant wail of sirens crept closer, a haunting sound that seemed to bounce off the courthouse walls. Miles stood by the car, staring into the darkened street, his mind racing. Dahlia's breathing was quick and uneven as she fumbled to tuck the forged deed into her leather bag. What now? She whispered. Miles's eyes sharpened. We don't run, he said firmly. We fight. Before Dahlia could answer, the harsh glow of headlights appeared at the end of the road. A black patrol car screeched to a stop, its doors flying open with a sharp metallic clang. Officer Daniels stepped out, his silhouette hulking and predatory under the streetlights. A cruel smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he adjusted the strap of his baton. Going somewhere, Bennett? Daniels called out, his voice dripping with venom. Miles squared his shoulders, his chin high as he turned to face him. Your threats don't scare me, Daniels. You're done. I have what I need to bring you down. Daniels let out a dark, humorless chuckle. You really think anyone's going to believe you over me? His voice echoed through the street, each word sharp as a knife. You're nothing here, Bennett, just a loudmouth city boy who doesn't know his place. You think I don't know exactly where I stand? Miles shot back, his voice rising. I know men like you, men who hide behind their badges and small-town power because they're terrified of losing control. You can't bully the truth out of existence, Daniels. Not this time. Daniels' smirk faltered. Something flickered in his eyes, rage, desperation, before he masked it again. That so? Daniels growled. He took a step closer, his hand dropping to the baton at his side. Because from where I'm standing, I see two people trespassing on government property, with stolen files no less. I don't think the sheriff, or the judge, would like hearing about that. You think they're on your side. Dahlia took a step forward, her voice shaking. You can't cover this up, Daniels. We have proof everything you've done will come out. Proof? Daniels sneered, his tone mocking. Oh, you mean the papers you've got stashed in that little bag of yours? He gestured lazily toward her shoulder. Hand them over now, and maybe, just maybe, I won't have to drag you both to jail tonight. Over my dead body, Dahlia spat, gripping the strap tighter. Miles put a calming hand on her arm, his gaze never leaving Daniels. Let's cut the games, Daniels. You're afraid because you know we're right. You know what happens when this gets out, when people find out you falsified evidence and used your badge to protect Thompson's corruption. Daniel's smile vanished. The mask slipped, and for a moment, Miles saw the man behind it, a man cornered, desperate, and dangerous. You think you're some kind of hero? Daniels hissed, stepping closer, the baton twitching in his hand. You're nothing but a liability. You don't belong here, you never did. That's where you're wrong, Miles replied, his voice quiet but forceful. I belong in every room you think I don't. Every courtroom, every council meeting, every position of power you're terrified of losing. And that's why you'll never win, Daniels. Because men like you can't stop people like me. The two men stood inches apart, the air between them taut as a wire. Miles could see it, the flicker of doubt and fear behind Daniels's anger. Then Daniels snapped. With a growl, he lunged, raising the baton high. Time slowed, the motion unfolding like a dark tide. Dahlia gasped, stumbling back, her bag slipping from her shoulder. But Miles was ready. He moved fast, sidestepping Daniel's swing with a precision that spoke of years of discipline. The baton whistled through the air, striking empty ground with a dull thud. Daniel spun, rage twisting his face as he swung again. Wild this time, uncalculated. Miles ducked, grabbing Daniel's wrist with a firm grip and twisting it sharply. The baton clattered to the pavement. Daniels howled in anger, jerking back, his chest heaving as the two men stared each other down. "You've already lost," Miles said, his voice cold. This is the moment your power ends." Daniels's face flushed deep red. "You think you can take me down?" he spat, his voice shaking. "You'll regret this, Bennett. You'll regret ever stepping foot in this town." "I won't be the one regretting this," Miles replied, straightening his stance. Before Daniels could respond, a pair of red and blue lights lit up the far end of the road. Another police cruiser pulled into view, its siren silent, but its presence undeniable. Miles turned his head slightly, just in time to see Officer Mitchell step out of the car, his face pale but resolute. "Daniels," Mitchell called, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Daniels spun toward him, his posture rigid. "What the hell are you doing here, Mitchell?" Mitchell held up his radio, his knuckles white around the device. "Back up," he said simply. "I called it in." "You what?" Daniels barked, his face contorting with rage. "Enough," Mitchell said sharply, stepping forward. "I saw what happened. I heard everything. This ends now." Daniels' mouth opened and closed, his shoulders rising and falling with labored breaths. For a long moment, it seemed like he might fight back, like the fury would carry him to a point of no return. But then his shoulders slumped, and the fight drained out of him. He turned slowly to face Miles, his eyes blazing. "You think you've won?" Daniels muttered, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over." "It's over for you," Miles replied, unflinching. "And tomorrow, the world will know why." By the time the additional officers arrived, Daniels had been led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of seething silence. Mitchell gave his statement to the arriving sergeant, his voice steady as he recounted the events, while Dahlia clutched her bag, still visibly shaken. Miles stood by the cruiser, hands in his pockets, his gaze distant as he watched Daniels disappear into the back seat of a patrol car. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself a deep, steady breath. Dahlia approached him, her voice soft. "We did it." Miles nodded, though his expression remained solemn. "This is just the beginning." Daniels was the symptom, not the cause. Thompson Carver. They're still out there. "And we'll get them too," Dahlia said firmly. "One step at a time." Miles turned to her, offering a faint smile. "One step at a time." A silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of tires on gravel as Daniel's cruiser pulled away. The weight of the night hung heavy, but there was something else there too. Resolve. "Let's get this to the state attorney," Miles said finally, "and let the world see the truth." Dahlia nodded, slinging the bag over her shoulder. "Lead the way, counselor." Miles looked once more at the quiet street, the courthouse looming dark and silent in the background. This fight was far from over, but for the first time in days, he felt it. The first crack of light breaking through the shadows. The morning light broke over Ashford, soft and golden, but its warmth couldn't reach the tension simmering beneath the surface of the small town. The courthouse steps, usually empty at this hour, were crowded with journalists, cameras flashing as a wave of chatter rippled through the crowd. A news van idled at the curb, its satellite dish tilted toward the sky. Miles Bennett stood at the center of it all, his dark suit crisp, his calm demeanor masking the storm he'd endured. Beside him, Dahlia organized a stack of files, the forged deeds, Daniel's arrest report, and sworn statements. Tangible proof of the corruption that had gripped Ashford Officer Mitchell, slightly apart from the press chaos, watched silently, his jaw set. Dahlia leaned closer, her voice low. "You ready for this?" Miles glanced at her. his eyes clear and focused. Always. He turned toward the podium where a microphone waited, feedback whining briefly before it settled into silence. The crowd stilled as Miles stepped forward, his tall frame cutting a confident silhouette against the rising sun. "Good morning," Miles began, his voice calm but powerful enough to carry over the assembled crowd. "My name is Miles Bennett, and I am here today to share the truth." The statement didn't need embellishment. In a matter-of-fact tone, Miles recounted the events. The falsified land records, Daniels' abuse of power, and the systemic corruption linking Officer Daniels, Judge Carver, and Land Baron Richard Thompson. With every word, the weight of the truth seemed to settle over the gathering, the anger and disbelief from the townspeople palpable. "For too long," Miles said. "Men like Daniels and Thompson have used their power to exploit this community. But today, that ends. I have provided evidence to the state attorney's office, which confirms that forged deeds were used to displace families and businesses. The individuals responsible will be held accountable." There was no anger in his voice, no gloating, just quiet, measured strength. Dahlia watched the crowd as murmurs broke out, some people nodding, others shaking their heads in shock. For the first time in decades, the town was hearing the truth out loud. Then Miles dropped the final blow. "I have also filed a motion for Judge Harold Carver's immediate recusal and a formal investigation into his decisions over the past 10 years. The people of Ashford deserve judges who serve justice, not those who serve their friends." A ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. The cameras flashed wildly, reporters shouting questions that Miles ignored. He stepped back from the podium, leaving the truth hanging in the air like a hammer waiting to fall. The fallout happened quickly. Within hours, headlines blazed across state newspapers and social media feeds. Small-town corruption exposed, officer arrested, judge under investigation. Attorney Miles Bennett shines light on systemic injustice in Ashford. By mid-afternoon, Officer Daniels' mugshot circulated online. His expression vacant, his once powerful presence reduced to a file photo and a list of charges: falsifying reports, intimidation, and abuse of power. The state attorney announced formal proceedings against Richard Thompson, pending a full review of the fraudulent deeds. Judge Carver, after receiving intense scrutiny, voluntarily stepped down, claiming health issues, though no one bought his excuse. For the first time in years, Ashford's courthouse felt lighter. The walls that had once held secrets and whispers now seemed to echo with the possibility of change. Back at the diner, the same small, run-down place where everything had started, Miles sat alone at the corner booth, the remnants of a black coffee cooling in front of him. Outside, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, bathing the town in hues of gold and orange. Dahlia slid into the seat across from him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I've been looking for you." Miles looked up, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "I needed a minute. I thought this place deserved a proper goodbye." She sighed, pulling out her phone and holding it up to him. "You're trending, by the way. Everyone wants to know who the Calm Crusader of Ashford is." "Calm Crusader? That's new," Miles replied, shaking his head. "Good branding," Dahlia teased before her tone softened. "You did it. Miles Daniels is out. Carver is done. Thompson will lose everything once this case hits court." Miles nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "It's a start," he said quietly. "Not a finish." Dahlia tilted her head. "How do you mean?" Miles looked out the window, where the people of Ashford were starting to gather in groups outside the courthouse, their voices animated, their expressions shifting from confusion to determination. "This town didn't get here overnight," Miles said. "Daniels and Carver. They're just the most visible cracks in a broken system. What happens next, that's what really matters." "You can't fix everything in one day, Miles," Dahlia said softly. "No," he agreed. But we can make a dent. In the days that followed, the weight of Miles's work settled over Ashford families, who had been forced out of their homes, began returning. Small businesses reopened their doors, their owners speaking quietly of hope, of justice, finally catching up to those who thought they were untouchable. For Officer Mitchell, the decision to speak out became a turning point. His testimony against Daniels helped solidify the case, but it also earned him quiet respect from those who saw the truth in his actions. Miles had been right. One person could make a difference. Miles stood on the steps of the courthouse one last time, his silhouette outlined against the rising sun. It had been a long fight, but he had faced it. Every insult, every challenge, every attempt to silence him. And he had come out standing tall. A small crowd had gathered again, though this time there were no reporters, just townspeople, ordinary people. Miles spotted the grey-haired waitress from the diner, the farmer who had scoffed at him once, and others whose expressions were softer now, more thoughtful. As he turned to leave, the old diner waitress stepped forward, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Bennett," she called. Miles stopped and turned to her, a question in his gaze. She looked down briefly, wringing her hands before meeting his eyes. "I misjudged you. I'm sorry for how I treated you before." For the first time in days, Miles smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. And with that, he walked down the steps, his head held high, his footsteps steady. As Dahlia pulled up to the curb in their car, she rolled down the window with a grin. "Ready to head back to the city?" Miles slid into the passenger seat, exhaling slowly as the weight of Ashford seemed to lift from his shoulders. "Not quite," he said, looking back toward the courthouse. Dahlia raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Miles turned to her, his expression thoughtful but resolute. "There are a dozen more towns just like this one, Dahlia, places where the system still doesn't work for everyone, people who need someone to stand up for them." Her lips twitched into a small smile. "You're going to make this a habit, aren't you?" "Someone has to." As the car pulled away, Miles looked out the window, watching the small town grow smaller in the distance. It wasn't perfect yet. There was still so much work to do. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like progress had begun. And for Miles Bennett, that was enough. For now. The wind swept softly across the open fields outside of Ashford as Miles Bennett leaned against the hood of his car, taking in the quiet expanse before him. Rows of golden crops swayed lazily under the sunlight, stretching toward the horizon like a promise that life, no matter how harsh or unjust, would always find a way to grow. It had been 3 days since the town of Ashford had been thrust into the spotlight. 3 days since Officer Daniels had been led away in handcuffs, his once commanding presence reduced to a man caught in the web of his own corruption. Judge Carver's voluntary resignation had followed soon after, his reputation irrevocably tarnished. The truth had come out. It wasn't clean. It wasn't perfect. But it was enough to turn a page. Standing in the silence of the countryside, Miles allowed himself a moment to reflect on what had brought him here. Not just to Ashford, but to this point in his life. He thought of his parents, who taught him to rise above every obstacle the world put in front of him. He thought of the nights in law school spent studying while working 2 jobs to pay tuition. He thought of the times he'd walked into courtrooms where people like him weren't expected to succeed, rooms where power belonged to a few, and justice felt optional. And yet, he had succeeded. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The events in Ashford weren't new to him. They were echoes of stories he had heard and lived his entire life. A rigged system. Men like Daniels, like Carver, clinging to their power with desperation. People like Richard Thompson, building their empires on the backs of those they thought couldn't fight back. But Ashford also reminded him of something else. The power of one person to make a difference. For all of Daniels' threats and Thompson's wealth, They hadn't been able to stop the truth from rising to the surface, and the truth, once exposed, became something more powerful than any badge, any gavel, or any bank account. The people of Ashford were beginning to see it too. The whispers that had haunted the town for years, whispers of unfair evictions, of people being driven off their land with no recourse, were finally being spoken aloud. Farmers and small business owners began to come forward, their voices hesitant but determined. The state attorney's office had launched an official investigation into land disputes and judicial corruption in the county. And Officer Mitchell. He had become an unlikely symbol of change, a man who had stepped over the invisible line between complacency and accountability. Mitchell's testimony had solidified the case against Daniels and Thompson, but his actions had done something more. They had shown the people of Ashford that silence could be broken, that loyalty to justice mattered more than loyalty to power. It wasn't just about Miles anymore. It was about all of them. Dahlia's car pulled up, the sound of gravel crunching under her tires, snapping Miles back to the present. She stepped out, her ever-present bag slung over her shoulder, her expression both tired and triumphant. "Paperwork's filed," she said, walking over to him. "Daniels's case is official. Thompson's land holdings are frozen pending investigation, and Carver won't be setting foot in a courtroom again." Miles nodded, a small but satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Good." Dahlia studied him for a moment, tilting her head. "You're thinking about what's next, aren't you?" Miles didn't answer right away. He turned to look back at the fields, where the land stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "I am," he admitted softly, "because there's always a next." Dahlia sighed, leaning beside him. "You can't save every town, Miles." "I don't have to," he replied, his voice steady. "But every fight like this, every truth that comes out, it changes something. Maybe it's small, maybe it's local, but it matters. This fight started with a piece of land, Dahlia. But it ended with people realizing they didn't have to stay silent anymore." He turned to face her, his eyes clear and certain. "And that's how it starts one town. One case, one truth at a time." Dahlia smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You really are impossible." Miles chuckled softly. "You knew that when you signed on." Miles had no illusions about the work ahead. Ashford wasn't unique. It was one of countless places across the country where power went unchecked, where corruption ran deep and silent. Men like Daniels, Carver, and Thompson weren't the exception. They were part of a larger broken system that protected itself. But the cracks were showing. Ashford's story was spreading. News anchors debated the case on national television, analysts praising Miles's perseverance and calling for reforms in judicial oversight and local law enforcement. Civil rights advocates picked up the story, using it as a rallying cry to demand accountability in small-town justice systems. The ripple had begun. Miles understood what it meant to take on fights like this. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. It came with sleepless nights, threats, and losses. But for every town like Ashford, for every family pushed out of their home, for every voice silenced by fear, there was no alternative. As they drove out of Ashford for the last time, Miles stared out the window at the fading town. The diner, the courthouse, the rows of houses that had seen generations of struggle. It would be easy for people here to forget what had happened, to move on as though the corruption had been nothing more than a storm passing through. But he knew better. Change wasn't an event. It was a process. And someone had to keep the momentum going. Dahlia glanced over at him as they merged onto the highway, leaving the town behind. "So where to next?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Miles looked ahead, his gaze steady. "Wherever they need me." She nodded, her smile soft. "Well, counselor, it looks like you've got work to do." "Always," Miles replied, his voice calm, resolute. The story of Ashford wasn't just about corruption. It was about the power of standing up, even when the odds were stacked against you. It was about speaking out, even when silence felt safer. It was about the choices we all make, whether to turn a blind eye or take a stand. Miles had seen it firsthand. People underestimated, dismissed, and silenced because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of power. But what Ashford had shown, what Miles had fought for, was that power didn't belong to the few, it belonged to the truth. And sometimes, all it took was one voice refusing to be quiet. As the car disappeared over the horizon, the field seemed to stretch on forever, golden and endless. The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves, as if whispering a reminder. The work was not done, but it had begun, and for Miles Bennett, that was enough to keep going. This closing section reflects on Miles's growth, his resilience, and the systemic issues he fought against. It offers closure while hinting at a broader fight for justice, inspiring readers with the idea that progress begins with one voice, one truth, one stand.